The plane was packed with passengers finding their seats and settling in for the long journey ahead. Among them was a calm, composed black woman who sat confidently in business class. Her presence was unassuming, yet there was something about the way she carried herself that set her apart. She wasn't the loudest or the most noticeable, but there was an air of authority about her that made you pause and pay attention. She was dressed in a tailored outfit, a subtle reminder that she was not just any passenger. She had worked hard to be where she was today, and today she was flying to attend a crucial meeting that could shape the future of her investments. But what the flight attendants didn't know as they zipped up and down the aisles was that this woman was no ordinary passenger. She had a stake in the airline. She had helped fund its growth and ensured that it remained competitive in an industry filled with challenges. She wasn't just someone who bought a ticket to travel, she was someone who made decisions that impacted the company's bottom line. From the seat she was sitting into the policies that guided its operations. The woman wasn't just here for the ride, she was here because she had a stake in the company's success. But none of that was visible to the flight attendants or the other passengers. As they glanced around, they saw a businesswoman in first class who probably had just enough to get by, someone they could easily ignore, dismiss, or make assumptions about. Like so many others who flew business class, her race wasn't a factor in how she was treated today. It was the assumption that she was just another well-dressed traveler who didn't warrant any further thought. But what would happen if the attendant knew who she really was? What if the woman was no longer just another customer sitting in an expensive seat? What if the flight attendants knew that she was a major shareholder, someone who had a hand in the very airline they worked for? Would their treatment of her change, or would she remain just a shadow in their eyes? The woman looked around at her fellow passengers as they chatted and checked their phones, lost in their worlds, unaware of the invisible threads that tied them all to the success or failure of the airline. None of them had any idea what she represented or the power she quietly held. The flight attendants made their way through the aisles, and one approached her without a second glance. The attendant smiled and asked if everything was to her liking. The woman nodded politely and said yes. She didn't make a fuss and kept to herself. She was used to this kind of indifference. It was part of the invisible world. She lived in a world where power was often underestimated or overlooked unless someone took the time to truly look. But she wasn't here for recognition or accolades. She was here because the airline needed her investment. The company needed her insight. She was part of the machinery that made it tick. The woman let out a quiet breath and leaned back in her seat. The plane hummed steadily as it climbed higher into the sky, but she knew that somewhere in this flight something unexpected was about to unfold. The flight was just beginning to settle into its rhythm as the seatbelt sign flickered off and the hum of the engines filled the cabin. But for one flight attendant, the calm was interrupted as she made her way down the aisle, scanning the passengers. Her eyes briefly met the woman in business class, and she immediately noticed a discrepancy in the seating chart. A few seats had opened up in economy class, and the attendant was informed by the supervisor that there needed to be adjustments made to better balance the seating. She hadn't thought much of it before, but now as she passed the woman in business class, she decided to act. She had no idea who this woman was or what she might represent to the airline, but she saw an opportunity to move someone from the more comfortable seats into the crowded back. To ensure everything aligned properly, the attendant approached with a professional smile and gently asked the woman if she'd mind moving to the economy section. The woman looked up with a slight confusion in her eyes as she processed the request. She wasn't rude or confrontational, but her response was calm yet firm, asking why she needed to move to a less comfortable space. The flight attendant glanced at the seating chart again, trying to quickly assess the situation. While trying to maintain her professional demeanor, she explained that it was a matter of logistics and that the airline needed to accommodate more passengers in business class. The woman's brow furrowed slightly, but she didn't immediately respond. The attendant pressed on, kindly offering her apologies for the inconvenience and explaining that this was standard procedure to ensure the flight could be as efficient as possible. The woman paused for a moment and then asked the attendant to double-check her seat, as if to say, "Are you sure?" The attendant assured her that the seat arrangements were correct, but the woman remained quiet for a bit. She didn't push back at first, but it was clear she was weighing the situation in her mind. She could feel the weight of being asked to move, but wasn't sure why the request was being directed at her of all people. She knew that there were others in the business class section who were perhaps more suited to move, but she chose not to press the issue right away as the attendant turned away to confirm the request with her colleague. The woman's mind raced. She had been traveling for business for years and had never once been asked to relocate mid-flight. Even when flights were crowded, she had always been respected as a high-status passenger. But now here she was caught in an unexpected moment where her status was being questioned. It wasn't the first time she had experienced something like this, and she wondered if the flight attendant even realized who she was or what her role was within the airline. What would happen if the attendant knew that she was a shareholder in the airline? Would the situation play out differently? Would she have been treated with more deference? Or would the dynamics of the interaction shift entirely? The woman sat quietly with her thoughts, wondering how this was going to unfold. She wasn't about to make a scene, but the unease in the air was undeniable. It wasn't just about the seat change, it was about something deeper, something that transcended the small issue of seating arrangements. The attendant returned with an apologetic expression on her face. Her previous sense of authority had dissolved now. There was a sense of awkwardness in her steps as she stood before the woman, unsure of how to proceed. The flight attendant stood there for a moment, not knowing how to begin her apology. Her confidence from earlier was completely gone and replaced with a sense of unease. She had expected the woman to comply without much resistance, but now as she looked at the woman sitting so calmly in her seat, the weight of her mistake began to sink in. The woman had not raised her voice or made any demands, but there was an unmistakable shift in the air. The flight attendant could sense it, and she knew she had crossed an invisible line. Something deeper was at play. The woman's eyes locked with hers, but she didn't say anything right away. Instead, she simply waited patiently, as if giving the attendant a chance to realize what had gone wrong. And then after a bit, the flight attendant spoke again, her voice tentative now, apologizing for the confusion and explaining that the airline had simply been trying to balance the seating arrangements. She tried to sound professional, but the words felt hollow. She couldn't quite muster the same level of authority she had before when she initially made the request. Her mind raced as she wondered how to get out of this awkward situation, and whether the woman would make a complaint. But what she didn't know was that the woman wasn't angry. She wasn't even upset. She was simply confused by the interaction and curious about what had just transpired. It was one thing to ask a passenger to move, but it was another to ask her to move in such a casual manner without realizing who she was. The woman didn't respond immediately. Instead, she looked at the flight attendant with a quiet patience, as if waiting for the next step. She could feel the change in the atmosphere. She could sense that the flight attendant was starting to realize her mistake, but the tension still hung in the air, thick and unspoken. The woman let the moment linger before finally speaking, her voice calm and steady. She asked the attendant if she had checked her records again. "Did you double-check the seating chart?" The attendant nodded quickly and mumbled something about confirming the seating arrangement with her supervisor. She was struggling to find her words as the weight of the moment made her feel more and more out of place. She was now keenly aware of how quickly assumptions were made, how easily people could be reduced to stereotypes without anyone taking the time to really understand who they were. The woman finally sighed and said something the attendant wasn't expecting. With a quiet tone, she asked why she was the only one being asked to move. Didn't the attendant think that someone else might also be causing an imbalance in the seating arrangements? The flight attendant looked around the business class section, her eyes darting from seat to seat, and for the first time she realized how wrong she had been in her assumptions. The woman wasn't just another passenger sitting comfortably in her seat. She was someone who deserved respect, not just because of the seat she occupied, but because of who she was. The woman was still calm, still collected, but the effect of her question hit the flight attendant hard. She was embarrassed, but also reflective. She had made a mistake not just in her actions, but in how she viewed the woman in front of her. The tension in the air had shifted again. This time it was less about the seating arrangement and more about the unspoken lesson unfolding before them both. The flight attendant stood there for a moment, her face flushed with embarrassment, her hands trembling slightly as she tried to find the right words, but nothing nothing seemed to come out right. She had made an assumption about the woman based on nothing more than her appearance and the seat she occupied, but now she was realizing that assumptions like these were far too dangerous, and limiting the woman who sat before her wasn't just another well-dressed traveler who might not mind being asked to move. No, this woman was someone far more significant, and the flight attendant felt the weight of her mistake even more sharply as she realized how easy it had been to overlook that fact. The woman watched her quietly as she struggled to speak. Her words were kind, but also laced with a sense of understanding, as if she knew exactly what the attendant was going through. It wasn't anger or frustration that the woman felt in this moment. It was more like a quiet recognition of how these small moments, these fleeting interactions, could reveal so much about the world around them, about how people were often reduced to labels without anyone taking the time to see them for who they really were. She finally broke the silence, her voice calm yet with an underlying strength, asking the flight attendant if she had ever thought about how many people in this very cabin were being treated the same way, how many others had been assumed to be less important than they really were. She asked if the attendant could imagine how those assumptions might feel if they were made against her every single day. The flight attendant hesitated, unsure how to respond. She wasn't prepared for this line of questioning, and yet somehow it felt like the woman was guiding her through a lesson she hadn't known she needed to learn. And then there was the silence again, a silence that felt more like a quiet teaching moment than an uncomfortable pause. The woman wasn't raising her voice or demanding an apology. She was simply making the attendant reflect on her actions and the impact they had. The flight attendant's mind raced as she replayed the interaction in her head. Her initial request had been so casual, so simple, and yet she had failed to recognize the deeper implications of what she had asked. She had assumed that the woman in business class was just another well-dressed traveler with no further questions to be asked, but she had been wrong. The woman had power, she had influence, she had a role in shaping the very airline the flight attendant worked for, and yet she had been treated as if she were just another person to be moved around for the sake of efficiency. The attendant's cheeks burned with shame, but the woman's tone remained gentle. It was clear that this wasn't about making the attendant feel bad, this was about making her think deeply about how easy it was to overlook the humanity of others, how easily people could be dismissed simply because they didn't fit into the right mold. The flight attendant took a deep breath and finally spoke, her voice quiet now, apologizing for her mistake. She explained that she hadn't meant any disrespect and that she truly hadn't realized who the woman was at first. But the woman simply nodded as if to acknowledge the apology without making it a bigger issue than it needed to be. The interaction had shifted completely. The power dynamic had changed. The woman had not raised her voice or made demands, but she had communicated something far more powerful than any confrontation could have achieved. The flight attendant stood there silently, feeling the weight of her own realization pressing down on her shoulders. She had been so focused on doing her job, so consumed by the task at hand, that she had failed to recognize the significance of the person she was addressing. Now, it felt like the whole atmosphere of the cabin had changed. The air felt heavier, somehow as if a deep truth had been revealed that no one could ignore anymore. The woman in front of her wasn't just a passenger, she was someone who held power and influence within the very company that employed the flight attendant, and yet she had been treated no differently than any other traveler who might have been asked to move for the sake of convenience. It was an uncomfortable thought, one that made the flight attendant question not just her own actions, but the systems and assumptions that had shaped her thinking over time. The woman remained calm throughout the entire interaction. She hadn't raised her voice or become confrontational. She had simply made the flight attendant confront her own ignorance without causing a scene or creating unnecessary drama. She had handled the situation with grace and dignity, but the impact of her words lingered in the air like a subtle but undeniable shift in the dynamic between them. The flight attendant swallowed hard and finally spoke again, her voice quieter now but filled with sincerity. She apologized once more for the misunderstanding and explained that she had simply been doing her job, trying to ensure the seating was balanced. But she knew now that her approach had been wrong. She knew that she had assumed too much and had failed to see the bigger picture. The woman nodded again, acknowledging the apology, but her expression remained calm and thoughtful. She didn't need to say anything more. The lesson had already been delivered in the simplest of ways, with no need for grand speeches or dramatic gestures. The flight attendant felt a sense of humility wash over her as she realized that this wasn't just about a seating arrangement or a misplaced request. It was about the way people were often reduced to their appearances and how easily they were dismissed without anyone taking the time to understand who they truly were. And as the woman in business class sat back in her seat, her calm presence served as a reminder that power didn't always need to be asserted in loud or aggressive ways. Sometimes true power came from quiet authority, from the ability to let others recognize their own shortcomings without ever having to shout or demand attention. The flight attendant felt a deep sense of gratitude for the woman's quiet wisdom, and as she walked away from the conversation, she couldn't help but feel like she had learned something far more valuable than any training manual could have taught her. It wasn't about the rules or procedures, it was about the people who were affected by them, the lives that were shaped by the assumptions that were made, and how important it was to look beyond the surface to truly understand the humanity of the person in front of you. The flight attendant walked down the aisle with a new perspective, but as she glanced at the woman one more time, she realized that the lesson wasn't over yet. It was something that would continue to linger with her long after the flight had ended, something that would change the way she interacted with every passenger she encountered from that point on. As the flight continued its smooth course through the sky, the flight attendant couldn't shake the feeling that something profound had just happened, something that went far beyond the simple request she had made earlier. She found herself glancing back at the woman in business class every now and then, her thoughts still lingering on the brief interaction they had shared. She had apologized, and the woman had accepted her apology with quiet grace, but there was still so much that the flight attendant needed to process. She had learned a lesson that she wasn't expecting to learn on a routine flight, and it was one that would stay with her for a long time. The woman in business class hadn't raised her voice or made a scene, but she had somehow managed to make the flight attendant confront her own biases and assumptions without ever uttering a word of judgment. The power of that moment was almost too subtle to recognize at first, but now it felt like a quiet force that had shifted something inside the attendant. She couldn't help but think about how many times she had done the same thing before, assuming things about people based on their appearances, their clothes, or their demeanor. She thought about how many times she had treated someone as less important because they didn't look the part or because they were quieter or less assertive than others. How many times had she made judgments without even realizing it, and how often had those assumptions been wrong? The woman had shown her a mirror. She had made the flight attendant question the way she saw the world and the people around her without ever demanding anything from her. It was an awakening in a way, a small moment that had peeled back layers of unconscious bias that she didn't even realize she had. The woman was a reminder that power didn't always have to be loud or forceful. Sometimes it was silent and unassuming. Sometimes it was the ability to navigate the world with a sense of quiet authority that spoke volumes without ever needing to raise one's voice or demand attention. It was the ability to remain composed in situations that might otherwise be frustrating or challenging and still maintain a sense of dignity and control without causing any unnecessary disruption. The flight attendant found herself reflecting on this as she continued her rounds, checking on passengers, delivering drinks and snacks. But her mind was no longer fully on the tasks at hand. She was still thinking about the woman in business class and the subtle shift that had taken place between them. The other passengers didn't seem to notice what had happened, that they were all busy with their own thoughts and activities. But for the flight attendant, the moment had changed everything. It had opened her eyes to the way people were treated and how assumptions were often made based on superficial judgments without anyone taking the time to truly understand the person they were interacting with. She felt a renewed sense of responsibility in her role. She felt like she had been given an opportunity to grow not just as an employee, but as a human being, someone who could look at others with more empathy and less judgment. She knew now that the work she did wasn't just about enforcing rules or following procedures, it was about making connections and treating people with the respect and understanding they deserved, no matter who they were or what they looked like. And she knew that the next time she interacted with a passenger, she would be different. She would be more mindful, more open, and more aware of the invisible forces that shaped her perceptions of the people around her. As the plane continued its journey toward its destination, the flight attendant felt a quiet sense of gratitude toward the woman in business class, the woman who had taught her a lesson that was more valuable than any protocol or policy she could have learned in a manual, a lesson about humanity, dignity, and the quiet power of presence. As the flight descended toward its destination, the flight attendant's mind remained fixated on the moment that had unfolded hours earlier. She could still picture the woman's composed expression, the quiet strength that had radiated from her without a single word of confrontation or anger. The flight attendant had seen power in many forms throughout her career, but this was different. It wasn't the loud, boisterous display of authority that she was used to. It wasn't the kind of power that demanded attention or submission. It was something much more subtle, something that spoke to the depth of character and the ability to navigate the world with grace and humility. She couldn't help but think about how rare that kind of power really was, how often people felt the need to assert themselves aggressively in order to be heard or respected. But the woman had done neither. She had simply existed with quiet confidence, and in doing so she had made the flight attendant question everything about her own assumptions and biases. It was a powerful realization, one that had stayed with her long after the woman had returned to her seat and the flight had resumed its course. And now, as the plane began its descent back to reality, the attendant reflected on the changes she felt happening inside her. She knew that this moment would stay with her. It wasn't just a one-time interaction that would fade into memory. It had already started to shape her perspective in ways she hadn't anticipated before. Her actions earlier that day had been based on an unspoken assumption that the woman sitting in business class was just another well-to-do passenger who wouldn't mind being moved for the sake of seating arrangements. But the truth was, the woman was more than that. She wasn't just another traveler, she was an influential figure within the very airline the attendant worked for. And yet, the flight attendant had never taken the time to question why she assumed that the woman would be okay with being asked to move. She had simply assumed that the woman was someone to be moved around and adjusted to the needs of the flight. But now she realized that there was far more to the woman than she could have ever imagined. The moment had revealed so much more than just a small misunderstanding. It had revealed the subtle ways that people were often underestimated or overlooked based on nothing more than the surface-level appearance of things. The flight attendant felt a renewed sense of humility. She wasn't sure what she had expected when she walked down the aisle to speak to the woman earlier. But she hadn't expected the lesson that had unfolded in front of her. She hadn't expected to be forced to confront her own assumptions about the world and the people in it. But now that she had, it felt like she had opened a door to something deeper, something that would stay with her throughout the rest of her career and life. She wondered if the woman had known all along how this moment would play out, if she had known that by simply existing and remaining calm, she would change the trajectory of the flight attendant's mindset without ever needing to raise her voice or make demands. The flight attendant realized that in her career she had been trained to serve customers, to follow the rules, and make sure everything ran smoothly. But she had never been taught to look beyond the surface, to see the people she was serving as more than just passengers and customers. They were individuals with lives and stories and roles in the world that went far beyond the seats they occupied on a plane. And the flight attendant promised herself that she would do better. She would take the time to see people for who they truly were, to understand their needs beyond the surface, to not make assumptions based on appearances, but to allow space for everyone to show who they were without fear of being dismissed or overlooked. The plane landed smoothly as the flight attendant moved through the final steps of her duties. Her thoughts were still tangled with the events of the day. As the passengers disembarked, she found herself replaying every moment from the interaction with the woman in business class over and over again, the subtle yet powerful way The woman had challenged her assumptions without even raising her voice. The calm dignity with which she had responded to the flight attendant's request, all of it kept echoing in her mind. She felt grateful for the experience yet uncomfortable with how much she had taken for granted until that moment. The woman had made her confront her own biases, and without doing anything but existing, she had helped her recognize how easy it was to overlook the people around her, to treat them as if they were just roles to be filled rather than individuals to be respected. She thought about all the passengers she had served over the years, how often she had acted on autopilot, taking for granted the status and power dynamics that shaped her interactions. She had never considered how that behavior might affect others, how it might make people feel invisible or disrespected simply because of assumptions she had made based on their appearance. She felt a deep sense of humility now. She realized that it wasn't just about making an apology or correcting a mistake, but about shifting her entire approach to how she interacted with others. She wanted to stop making judgments based on outward appearances. She wanted to see people not just as passengers, but as individuals with their own stories, their own complexities. She wanted to learn to recognize the power in subtlety and the strength in silence. She had been given a chance to change her perspective, and she was determined to take that opportunity. She wasn't sure how to begin, but she knew it was something that would take time and conscious effort. She would start by listening more closely to the people around her, seeing them for who they really were, and giving them the space to express themselves beyond the labels and categories that society so often imposed on them. She didn't want to be the kind of person who only saw others through a lens of convenience or stereotypes. She wanted to be someone who saw the humanity in everyone and treated them with the respect they deserved. The flight attendant looked around the now empty cabin as the last few passengers made their way down the jet bridge. It was strange how the space had changed. It felt different, now more open, somehow as if the walls had come down, and she had a clearer view of the world around her. She thought about the woman in business class and how she had made such a profound impact without even trying. She thought about how her quiet strength had been the catalyst for the flight attendant's own awakening, and realized that in that single moment the woman had done more than just correct a misunderstanding. She had shown her a different way of being in the world, a way that was more compassionate, more aware of the underlying connections between people, more attuned to the invisible threads that tied them all together. The flight attendant took a deep breath as the last of the passengers disembarked, feeling a quiet sense of gratitude settle within her. She didn't know if she would ever see the woman again, but she knew that the lesson she had learned would stay with her for the rest of her life. And as the door to the jet bridge closed, and she prepared for her next flight, she knew that she would carry that lesson with her in every interaction she had from that point forward. The world might be full of assumptions and misjudgments, but she could choose not to participate in that. She could choose to see the people around her for who they really were, and in doing so she could make the world just a little bit better, one conversation at a time.